Let's talk a little bit about headstock veneers. They're great because if you use ebony or other darker woods, it provides nice color contrast across the build. You can tie in a theme with the fretboard or something. And a lot of times you're not using a super dark wood material for the neck, so inlaying a logo can be a little problematic. And doing an ebony headplate or a darker wood headplate will help you with that. Another purpose is obviously to cover up our scarf joint, and this will cover up the face part of the scarf joint, whereas when we do a backstrap it will cover the back of that, but that is something that we will be doing later. There are several ways to do a headplate veneer. One way is to simply glue it onto the headstock and leave a little bit hanging over the break, and then plane it flat and level with the fretboard surface. And for that way you obviously have to put this on before the fretboard goes on, or else you won't be able to plane that. The fretboard will get in the way. The other way that I like to do is a way that provides you with a nut slot that the nut actually kind of locks into. It's sandwiched between the end of your headplate veneer and the fretboard. And the way that I do this is I cut a matching angle into the edge of my headplate veneer before I glue it on, so that it is perpendicular to the fretboard surface. Here's a little jig that I made to do that. What it is it's simply two pieces of wood screwed together, both exactly the same size, with these two ends being parallel to another, so that when this end registers on the fence of my table saw, it sends this end through perfectly aligned with the blade tilted at 13 degrees. As you can see, 13 degrees off quarter, that is. And what this allows me to do is allows me to clamp the veneer in between these two pieces and just have a little tiny bit sticking out here, set my blade to 13 off quarter, and send it through the table saw. Now, there's a bunch of reasons why this is a good idea. One, because if you were to try to do that with such a thin piece of material without support on either side, you'd get a lot of chip out and you'd have a rough edge, which isn't something we want. The other reason why this is good is because it allows you to get that perfect angle to match your scarf joint, which would be very difficult to do with, say, a hand plane on something that's that thin. One last piece of advice for this jig. Before you put the veneer in, draw your center line and then draw your template outline on it so that you can put a line where you need the cut to go, so that when you put it in the jig you can still see where your perpendicular is, because I can't see the center line through my jig. One thing I wanted to talk about was headplate thickness if you're doing the lock-in nut style like this and not the plain flat onto the plane of the fingerboard method we talked about earlier. One reason why this is important is because, as you can see, this does reinforce the scarf joint. However, it doesn't reinforce the area where underneath the nut. This is important to keep in mind because the thicker your headplate becomes using this method, the thinner the actual neck section of the headstock becomes. And as mentioned earlier, the headplate isn't reinforcing this nut area, so actually the thicker the headplate becomes with this method, the weaker the nut area becomes and more prone it will be to cracking and breaking. The next step is to glue on your headplate veneer onto your neck. And as you can see here, I've put a stop block where the nut will be. This is for a neck that doesn't already have the fretboard on it. What you can do if you have a fretboard is just make a stop block that from about here back is a 1/4 inch shallower to match your fretboard, so that this can sit on the fretboard yet still create a stop for the headstock veneer. And since this has our cut in it, it butts up perfectly. Here is an example of what I've done for a block for something that already has a fretboard on it. The process we're going to go through is I've put a center line on here as well as on here, just to make sure that my cut is square and I can align things perfectly. And as you can, well, you probably can't see from that far away, but things line up perfectly as they should. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put glue on it, tape it into place. That's a very important thing, because when you apply clamps, it is going to put pressure on things and try and move stuff around, especially with a slippery surface of glue. So I like to use tape to bind things in place before I put my clamps on. I often put tape like this to apply direction uphill. And I'll do the same with the initial clamp. You can, if you've ever used these squeeze clamps, they pull towards the bar. So a lot of times I will start with a clamp like this just to get everything situated, if it'll clamp, so that it pulls ever so slightly that way before I start putting the bigger clamps on. But yeah, squeeze clamps are a good way to start. They're pretty quick to apply. They don't do any damage, and they're easy to get off, so if something does go wrong, like something gets out of line, you can fix it. And I'm going to go ahead and apply the rest of the clamps. Alright, here's what it looks like when you're done, and just for safe measure, I remove the stop block after everything is clamped in place and I know it's not going to move. That way I don't risk gluing my stop block to my neck. It's now time to talk about thicknessing the headstock so that we can apply our back strap to cover the back of the scarf joint. Now what I have here is I have a piece of plywood that I have thicknessed to be a 1/16 of an inch thinner at the nut end than it is at the tip. The reason I do this is because I like to do a 5/8 inch headstock near the nut to keep things thicker, but tapered down a 1/16 of an inch. It gives an elegant look, also gets rid of some of the weight you don't need down here to make headstock slightly less neck heavy. But it's a thing that a couple luthiers do that I've picked up, and I seem to like the look of it and the theory behind it. You don't have to do that. Headstocks can range anywhere from about 5/8, a little more, to all the way down to 1/2 inch. I suggest measuring some of the headstocks that you have around the house to see what you like. So what we're going to be doing is, you can see there's a line down the side of my neck, and this follows where the neck carve is going to go. In this next case, 0.8 inches at the 1st fret to 0.9 inches at the 11th fret. And what this is going to do, and I'm putting this on the treble side of the neck, what this is going to do is when we start sanding, I'm going to be able to see where the neck is, and I'm going to sand all the way down the headstock until I hit a little bit past that line. The further past this line you go, all the way up to past it by the thickness of your backstrap, the farther this backstrap is going to extend into the neck, so you'll see it go further down the neck. This is the setup I'll be using. It's my spindle sander set up with the largest drum possible, and I've set a fence up to have this plate follow so that I can accurately thickness the headstock, and I'll be taking it down in several passes to ensure a smooth surface, as well as to not overwork the drum and get it heated or whatnot. And here's what it looks like when it is done. Here you can see what I'm talking about, where I go a little bit beyond my line so that the headstock backstrap comes into the neck a little bit. And we'll see what that looks like when you watch the video on carving the neck. Alright, as you can see, I have smoothed out this area where the backstrap is going to go. And I did this because even though the spindle drum leaves a pretty decent surface, it's not perfect, and I want this to be a nice gap. So I have sanded this by hand. Now over here we have the back strap, and if you're using a book-matched piece like this is actually the face. If you're using a book-matched piece like this, I either suggest one, gluing it up with super glue because that's more heat resistant than tight bond, or if you use tight bond, put some tape across the joint stretched to try and pull the joint together, so if for some reason you do overheat it when bending, the tape will keep the joint tight. Alright, for this procedure it's pretty similar to what we did for the wood binding earlier. At this thickness, which in my case is 40 thousandths, that's what I like to use for a backstrap, 40 to 50 thousandths. A lot of woods don't actually need any water to be bent. However, just in case I'm working with a difficult wood, I do keep some water around just in case. And just slow and steady wins the race. And you can see that it's starting to bend. We'll come back when I'm done with the bend and talk about glue up. Alright, and here you can see the finished bend. Try and get as close as possible, but as you can see, a little tiny bit. I mean, that looks bigger in the camera view. It's really only about a 36th of an inch. And when I press down, the clamps will get rid of that. Try and not leave too much of a gap, because you don't want any unintentional forces on your neck. And although this is a thin piece of wood, the amount of pressure that forcing this down when gluing will apply to the neck is minimal. I still don't like to have unnecessary stresses in my woods and my builds. Alright, and here you can see the backstrap being glued up. Since the head plate's already on, I have a plywood caul on the front to protect the head plate from clamping marks. And I have another caul on the back that I made with a radius equal to that of the drum I use on the spindle sander, so that it will keep pressure on the curved up area of the backstrap. The way that I built this caul is important. It's softwood, which is slightly pliable, as well as a thin layer of cork glued to it. And the reason I use cork is twofold. One, it will squish a bit so that when you clamp, if there's any discrepancy between the caul shape and the headstock shape, the cork will still allow you to clamp accurately and squish down. Secondly, if any of the glue from squeeze out does get onto your caul, it won't glue the caul to the backstrap because of the fact that the cork is quite weak and will just break off of the caul instead of being stuck to the backstrap. One important thing to notice is that once again I used blue tape to keep everything in place while I did the glue up. One last thing I want to mention about clamping up head plates and backstraps is if you are using a tight bond glue or similar, like I prefer to use for this application, you are introducing a lot of moisture to what is actually, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively thin piece of wood. And this is going to make it want to warp and cup, because the moisture introduced, let's say you're gluing a head plate on this side, is going to expand these cells, while up at the top here it's not going to, so it's going to make it want to cup in a U shape like this. So anytime I do any head plate or backstrap gluing up, I keep it clamped in this exact way for at least overnight. I usually like to leave them 24 hours if I have a choice, and then for another while I keep them clamped to a flat surface. I know this is a little overkill, but I don't like to risk it. You've put so much work into the neck at this point, it would be a shame to have it cup and become useless simply because of a veneering.